It's with great, great pleasure that we have our guest speaker tonight for many, many reasons. And I will just briefly speak before I pass the microphone to Dean, because it's with great pleasure and honor that you're coming from UC Berkeley, which is where I grew up, more or less, in San Francisco, which was Berkeley is the East Bay. And also, it's wonderful that Catherine Greenberg is with us, which I don't know, you are somewhere here, yes. Because a number of years ago, maybe 9, we sort of calculated 9 years, I think. During the process of building this museum, and in discussions with late Pierre Berger about the future of what the Jardin Majorelle should be, we both came to the agreement that it was a place not only of just beauty, or a place where people could find a sense of peace and calm in this sort of expanding place called Marrakesh, but also a place of learning, and also a place of scientific excellence in that sense. And as a Californian growing up in San Francisco, although I left there when I was 19 or 18, but to go to New York to school, but the places that meant a lot to me were places like the UC Berkeley Botanic Garden, where I had been many times, or another garden in Southern California called the Huntington Garden, which, if those of you that don't know it, I hope one day when you are in California, you will go visit these places, because they are the Botanic Garden in UC Berkeley, which is part of the University of California, which has a number of campuses around the state of California. The UC Berkeley's Botanic Garden currently has over 10,000 plant species, if I'm being correct in what Wikipedia has told me recently. But it was a garden that was created in 1890, I believe, for the study of plants. Originally it was the study of indigenous plants from California. And then, so many, well, I wasn't there in 1890, but I was there in 2015 with a young botanist who then subsequently became our director of living collections, the French botanist Marc Janson, who gave a lecture at the UC Berkeley Botanic Garden on palm trees, who is also the co-curator of our exhibition Cactus, which I invite you all, if you have not seen it, following the lecture, you will have the chance to visit the exhibition. It will be open until 9 p.m. tonight. But so Mark and I happened to be in San Francisco at the same time. He gave a wonderful lecture about palm trees, which is his specialty, at the UC Berkeley Botanic Garden, in an extraordinary small structure designed by Anne Morgan. And then, because he had never been to the west coast of California, or the west coast of the United States, we went down to Southern California to the Huntington Garden. And in walking through all that, I said, you know, this is what I would love to be, not that we have the pretensions that we could ever become the Huntington Garden, which is 130 acres. And how many hectares? Someone will translate for me that for me quickly, but it's very big. But the idea that it was a research center, it was a learning center, it was a center of excellence, and that's what I really felt Majorelle could become. And it was something I discussed with Pierre Berger during, as I said, during the construction of this museum. And so it's been a number of years that we have been working diligently. We've got an extraordinary staff, whether they be the museum staff, of which I'm very proud of. And the Cactus exhibition is an example of that. We have an extraordinary garden botanic staff we've really made great headway and great advancements in really trying to excel and be the best as we possibly can. But anyway, so it's with great pleasure and honor to have you here. We have a few slides that I guess you're the one that you're the controller of slides. But we just wanted to show you a few examples before Dean takes over and speaks about the importance of what a botanic garden is and examples of those in California and the history of them, because California is very rich in its biodiversity, and also to see how we've also tried to reorganize the garden here in these past 5-6 years. The COVID allowed us to make massive transformations, massive amount of work since we're open to the public, 365 days of the year. And it's a moment that for us it's also to have someone from the exterior, like Dean, with his incredible knowledge on cactus, which is also a plant family that I think many of us know little about, and we should know more about because of climatic changes. It's a plant family that we are favoring more here within our garden because of the issues that many of us are facing, and it's a family that I think we can all learn from. So it's with great pleasure I have you here, and I'll let you take over. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Madison.
I will leave the stage, so you've got it on your own.
I was delighted when Madison invited me here to talk because the Majorelle Garden is one of the most iconic gardens in the world. And that's not just cactus gardens, that's of all gardens. And for someone like myself, who is a very large fan of cacti that have been growing them since I was in high school, since before college, the opportunity to come and talk about this plant group was irresistible. And since this was in collaboration with the art show, the art exhibition Cactus, I thought it might be nice, rather than to talk really about the biology and the sociology of cacti per se, as I do in my essay in the catalog, that it might be nice to really talk a little bit more about cactus collections, cactus gardens, their evolution over time, particularly in California, which has so many public cactus gardens, so it's one of the best places to look at a significant sample and see what their significance is really for cactus garden design and, of course, succulent garden design, but really for garden design in general. And, of course, cacti are very important in the culture and in also the economy of Morocco. They're not native here. All cacti, with one exception, are native to North and South America. But they've been grown here for over 400 years, so they've been very important part of it. And no doubt when Monsieur Majorelle came here, he definitely saw a lot of cacti, and that was definitely had to be one of the things that inspired him to start this magnificent garden. And and here we see a picture of it. As we talk about these gardens in California, you may say, what is the relevance? Of course, the relevance is partly that California has a very similar climate to parts of Morocco, certainly. Marrakesh is very much like the climate in Southern California, perhaps a little bit interior, and we'll be looking at gardens that are in a variety of areas of California. And at the end, just for a few minutes, we'll bring it back to the Majorelle Garden and do some comparisons and talk about the uniqueness that is represented by this magnificent garden. Succulents, of course, cacti and other succulents have been grown in California for at least 160, 70 years, probably a little bit longer if we count the mission period and the movement of Opuntia, the Barbary fig, or prickly pear, as it's often called in English, up by the Spanish fathers. But very few of these plants that were early grown, these specimen plants, many of them were dug up from the desert. Many of them did not adapt very well. The most notable example is the saguaro cactus, which grows in Arizona, not so far from California, but is really poorly adapted to the Mediterranean-type climate with the wet winters and the hot, dry summers that it experiences in California. And so very few, although these must have existed, almost none of them have survived. A few other types of succulents have survived, and this shows one. This is a magnificent specimen of the dragon tree, Dracaena draco, from the Canary Islands, right? And also, now we know, only in the last 30 years or so, from southern Morocco as well, one little place in southern Morocco. This must be a plant that was planted, it's well over 100 years old, and yet there are a few older ones known from California. And if we look at the size of this plant, it is actually bigger than all but a handful, maybe even 2 or 3 of the ones that are left in the wild. As far as we know, the first attempt to really make a cactus garden, as it were, a garden that had not all cacti, but cacti were a dominant theme in it, also agaves, yuccas, and many other plants, was this first Arizona garden at the Hotel Del Monte in Monterey on central coast of California. And if we look at these postcards illustrating it, we can see the very Victorian Belle Epoque approach with these small beds, very nice for men and ladies with their long skirts to walk around through the paths, and also the scalloped edges and this very high diversity of plant species. So they have cacti, we can see the Barbary fig, prickly pear, agave, there are saguaros in here in the back, also a dragon tree probably, yuccas, and then pampas grass, a very large grass that does not grow in the desert, also fan palms, and even a monkey puzzle tree, which didn't survive very long, I don't think, in this garden. Araucaria araucana, sorry. Now, Leland Stanford was a very wealthy man who made his money in the railroad. Many of the most rich people in California in those early days, in the late 19th century, in fact, made their money from the railroad. And he and his wife decided to build a large estate south, about 60 kilometers south of San Francisco in Palo Alto, California. And he hired the same person who designed the other Arizona garden to do one here. And since he had access to these train cars, in fact, he had a spur line, a track coming right up to his new property. He sent out crews to go up and dig up all these saguaros from the wild and plant them in this garden and have this new Arizona garden. But you can see here that as well as the cacti and succulents, we have Italian cypress, Cupressus sempervirens, and also in the back, we can see some kind of conifer. Perhaps it is an abies, a fir tree, we would say in English, and obviously not something well adapted to California, and not lowland California. We have native ones up in the north and in the mountains, but not here, not near the coast. And this garden was beloved for many, many years, but what happened was, unfortunately, their teenage son died. Leland Stanford Jr. died, and they were so brokenhearted, but instead of developing a large estate with a mansion, they developed Stanford University. So I have to say it was a tragedy for the Stanfords, but I think the rest of us, the world in fact, has benefited from the amazing university here. Their tomb is immediately right next to the Arizona garden, the only part of their estate that was ever built. And so we can see that this tomb represents not just a memorial to Mr. and Mrs. Stanford, but also, in a way, a memorial to the mansion that was never built. And some of the plants and trees have survived all these years, about 140 some years until the present. However, in the 1920s, when I'm sure there's certain things that happened in the world economy at that time, and even Stanford University, believe it or not, was quite poor, they stopped maintaining the garden. And so we had a very interesting experiment at that point. It's the kind of experiment that no one would run on purpose, no one would do it, and no one would have the time to have 70 years of complete neglect. But when they went in the late 90s and decided to do a restoration of this garden, because what was left, this is the list of the hundreds of species planted in this garden originally, only about 15, I don't know the exact number here, actually survived. And you can see a 100-year-old yucca growing here in the photograph. But if you want to know what to plant in your garden, in a somewhat similar climate that you won't have to take very good care of, and it'll still survive and probably do very well. This is a very good list to start with. It's also good to know that almost nothing else you plant is going to survive past a few years without your assiduous care. Of course, we all love our plants, and we do our best to take care of them. Part of this restoration that I want to point out here, and I think this is interesting, and we're going to talk a little bit more about the collector's garden, because all of these gardens were somewhat random in the sense that they only took whatever plants they could find that they thought were interesting, and then they would send the gardener out, their landscaper out, to walk around and find a very nice place to put it. Oh, I think it will go very well here. So they're very much were in this approach. Luckily, they were cacti, and we'll talk about that when we get to the Huntington, which is a good thing. But as we got to more modern, as things went on in time, more modern approaches came up. And this is my favorite vignette in the Arizona garden at Stanford in its restored state. It's been restored now about 20 years. This is 2 species of euphorbia. Now, you would swear that this is a cactus. These are 2 cacti. Neither of these are cacti. Both of these are spurges, the genus Euphorbia. It is a group that evolved succulents, to look just like cacti in South and Central Africa. In fact, some are native even to North Africa. And you can see here 2 different species, very similar and yet different. And this idea of pairing similar but distinct species of succulent or cactus together is something we'll see repeatedly in the various gardens in the more modern plantings that they have done. And it often is a very effective technique. We'll talk about it a little bit more later when we talk about the Ruth Bancroft garden. Henry Huntington was another man who made his fortune through the railroad. He built his estate in Southern California, and as Madison said, he created, over time, basically, his wife, they built this mansion, and she was very much into the decor of the house and collecting art, and she more or less kicked him out of the house and said, do whatever you want in the estate as long as you give me enough flowers and vegetables for the table. And so he and his landscape architect, they put together, first, of course, what else would you do? You just built a mansion. You put a nice formal garden around the mansion that looks very much like a European formal garden. He also then, but he wanted innovation. He wanted it to be different. He wanted to show how different and how much money you could have to do something very, very, that is not nothing like anything else in the world. And the first thing he bought after this was a Japanese garden, which had been done by this very good Japanese garden designer back in the day, just in the early 20th century. And he was able to purchase it lock, stock, and barrel and dig up the plants and move them to his yard. And then his landscape designer, Hertrich, said he was German, and he remembered from being a child growing cacti on his windowsill. And he said, why don't we do a cactus garden? It's Southern California. It's beautiful. We can plant them outside. And unfortunately, Henry Huntington, he had had a lot of experience with cacti along the railroad in the Southwest. And always when he got out, they would come and attack him. So he didn't like the idea at first. But he was eventually talked into it. And they put in this beautiful cactus garden. And as Madison has said, it is one of the most notable cactus gardens in the world. It certainly is a very large one, too. Now, as you can see here, we have many of these columnar cacti, as well as some other plants put in here. And that's the nice thing about cacti because of their sculptural forms. And particularly if you're using landscape cacti, which tend to be the taller and more cylindrical ones, even you can just really go out and plop them around in rather random patterns. And as they mature, they're going to have a pleasing form. They're going to form, it won't look like, as we would say in English, a dog's dinner, a complete mix. It would look like, although it is variation, it would actually give a very nice aesthetic look. And that's what much of the succulent garden and you can see the very large old, the large old dragon tree in the background. There we go, there it is. But we can see several different species here that I've listed at the top. Now, this part of the succulent garden in the Huntington Gardens, and I guess I should have prefaced this by saying the Huntington Gardens has a lot of space. they have a lot of space. So this type of gardening is not necessarily the kind of thing that anyone can do. Even people who have public gardens are often very constrained by space. But in this case, the golden barrel cactus, one of the most famous cacti, and perhaps arguably one of certainly of the short cacti, is perhaps the most sculptural and beautiful of cacti to use in the landscape. In the wild in Mexico, it is native to only a very small area, and in fact, it may be all but extinct in the wild because the Mexican government some years ago flooded and put a dam and made a reservoir on the entire habitat of this species. However, it is very common in cultivation, and you can see here the repetition, the many, many different ones. So there's only one species of cactus here, and then mostly one species of blue agave. And you can see the repetition. This is a very important element in modernist gardens, and also the color harmonization, which is something that the early gardeners did not really particularly value or think about very much. They figured you just put them all together and they're all cacti and they'll look good. And that is actually true, but they can look even better when there's a more deliberate approach to color. And just as a side note, I would say that is something that Monsieur Majorelle knew very well, even back in the 1920s when no one else was doing it. Because I suspect this is from the 60s or 70s, something like that, a much, much later planting. Another one, these are two species that if you've been to the Majorelle garden, and I think most of you have, then you probably recognize these species. The one is the common Barbary fig, or prickly pear, if you prefer, Opuntia ficus indica. And on the left, we can see, in English, we call this the Mexican fence post cactus. And it is used both these species, especially the one on the left, is used very much in the Majorelle garden. Now, in my opinion, this is my opinion, of all the columnar cacti, Lomericerius marginatus, this cactus here, is the most vertical of all cacti. It reaches for heaven, right? And so when you have a group of these planted together, you're really not having a collection, but an exaltation. Of course, as I said, the Huntington Garden is still very much a collector's garden. It still is very much a garden where they bring in new species all the time. And this is a very beautiful agave, agave avetifolia. It has one feature that makes it not very amenable to widespread cultivation, and that is, unlike most agaves, it does not offset. So when it flowers, the plant dies, and it must be grown from seed. Of course, nursery people have figured out a way around that, and they've propagated several. But the Huntington Gardens is one of the first gardens to get a hold of seed of this, to grow it, and to use it in their gardens. And now this species is being used very extensively in California. And in fact, there's at least 4, if not more, cultivars that the nurserymen manage to propagate vegetatively. But it doesn't naturally do that. And as I hinted before, the Huntington Garden has a huge amount of space. And so one of the I think it is the most recent garden actually, is their children's garden. This is just the edge of it. And this was just done about 15 years ago. I think that's about right. And we can see here very much the modernist approach, so very different from the regular succulent cactus garden at the Huntington. We can see the use of dominance of hard surfaces. The hardscape is dominant. And we can see also the use of very geometrical forms, so circles, not so much here, but squares, or very straight lines, slabs, these horizontal, these very strong lines. And also, mostly, usually, these hardscapes are neutral in tone. And of course, I'm sure all of us here can think of one cactus garden that is a huge exception to that kind of general approach. And then if we look at the succulents that are used here, we can see the rule of 3 being followed. So some repetition, but very small, and they're very sculptural. In this case, not a cactus, but another Mexican succulent, Bocarnia recavata, which is called in English the ponytail palm. It is not a palm, it's more closely related to some mop-headed plants like this. So this shows this extreme, in a way, extreme, but very beautiful, I think, modernist approach. And this children's garden, which I didn't have time to include other things, is very elaborate. And this is having children in the garden is something that almost all botanic gardens do. The Majorelle Garden has a growing youth program, and many gardens around the world do this. Very few of them have the money and the space to do what they did at the Huntington Gardens. But there are also a lot of little small nonprofits, of course, that are working with gardening and with environmental education with youth, directly often with a specific school or a specific school district. I happen to be involved in this one, which is called Creek, a very small community organization in my town that we work with kids, usually teenagers, but sometimes a bit younger, and teach them sort of hands-on gardening skills and even practical skills that they could possibly use for going into landscaping and nurseries, such as, we go out and collect the native seed in the wild, or we bring it back, we grow it, we propagate, we repot, we weed, we work with irrigation systems. So this is a group, and you can see here with using the recycled materials. We're a very poor organization, but nevertheless, we are doing a lot of good in our very small local community. And recently, I just had to put a little plug in here that I just finished. We're installing a rather large educational garden at our middle school garden in our community. It has various sub gardens. It has a dinosaur garden, or Cretaceous a dinosaur plant garden. It has an orchard to bear fruit during the school year. It has native plant section, and it has 3 different large beds that are dedicated to North American succulents, South American succulents, and South African succulents. So, this, once again, if we're talking about a collector's garden, this is very much a collector's garden because it is specifically aimed at education and interpretation for the young people who are at the school right behind, kind of to my left over there. Lotus Land is a place, another old estate in Montecito, California. If you don't know where Montecito, California is, it's in central southern California. It is right next to Santa Barbara, California, which you may have heard of. Now, of course, Santa Barbara is rich, and the people who are much richer, they live in Montecito. She was a retired opera singer, and she was a very dramatic woman. And she married a much less dramatic but much richer husband who ended up dying much before her. And she spent decades creating this wonderful estate in Montecito. She took a great deal of whimsy sometimes in her approach. She was not afraid of doing things that other people might find in questionable taste. So here shows this garden clock that is planted with carpet bedding, but the carpet bedding is all succulents. One of the cactus garden there is something else, because in fact it wasn't developed until after she was dead. She had a very good friend who was a cactus aficionado. He only grew these large columnar cacti, and he grew them from seed, and he did it from 1929 to 1999. And in the 1960s, he promised Madame Volska that he would donate his collection to her when he died. Of course, he outlasted her, but the garden took that promise on, and they hired a local designer to do this design with these rather large and very large number and great diversity of columnar cacti. And you can see here, I love the very modernist approach. In some ways, of course, rocks were used in the Victorian garden, but look how large these are. These are basalt boulders that are brought in. And then look at the top dressing. The mulch, if you will, the rock mulch, is a black slate. No one I know has done that before. And when you consider that, the plants themselves go from green to somewhat blue, and then the muted tones of the entire garden, the riotous nature and the sculptural thing, this is, in some ways, and obviously it's not black and white, but it's a little bit more like taking something a photograph of a very dramatic scene and making it in black and white. It creates a very, almost somber, but also very striking approach. And it took a lot of nerve, really, a lot of boldness to do it. This shows here these basaltic pillars that occur naturally in Eastern California. I don't know how they got a hold of them. I thought they were in a national park, but they got a few. And I just wanted to mention that, remember, Montecito is actually very close to the coast. You can drive down the hill and be at the ocean in 5-10 minutes. So it gets very warm, it never gets cold, but it never gets very hot, or very rarely. And so using the black slate as the mulch is a very good thing, because many of these columnar cacti are heat lovers, true heat lovers. Many cacti are true heat lovers. And this boosts the soil temperature during the summer and even during the winter when it's sunny, which is a lot of the time in Montecito, and helps them do it. Now, this is something you would never attempt here in Marrakesh. It is just too hot in the summer, and you might end up burning the roots of many of the plants. However, Madison Cox has done a somewhat similar treatment in having this pinkish gravel used as a mulch in the Majorelle garden. And it's extremely effective there. And because of its lighter color, it not only sets off the cacti more dramatic, there's more contrast, but it also provides a little less overheating than you might get from a very dark use of a crushed rock mulch. Some gardens will never be designer showcases because it's in their DNA, it is written into their mission, into their very founding documents, that they exist to support the greatest diversity of plants possible. And this is, of course, true of university collections, such as the University of California Botanical Garden in Berkeley, California, a place near and dear to my heart, and also Madison's. And so there we have a collector's garden. They have updated some of their plantings to make them a bit more design-worthy, but ultimately they're about the great diversity. And every plant in that garden, almost, with the exception of the economic plant garden, was collected came from wild-type material. So this is Aeonium urbicum. You may know Aeonium. So there's 1 or 2 species native to Morocco. Most of them are native to the Canary Islands. And they're Mediterranean-type adapted plants, adapted to the winter rainfall and the warmer or hotter dry summers. This shows Aeonium urbicum, a very nice species, but you can see that this is one of the ones, like that agave, that after it flowers, it tends to die. But if you look at their New World garden, it has a lot of columnar cacti, and in fact, this is what used to be, hold on, a opuntia, but now it's a cylindropuntia. And these here are actually bromeliads, terrestrial bromeliads from the Andes. And that's because in the 60s and 50s and 60s, they took several different expeditions to the Andes, to Chile, to Peru, and they collected these things. Some of these have never been identified, and they may be new species, even to this day, 50 or 60 years after being collected. Another collector's garden, but one I think that is very special to me because I was a garden director of this garden for several years, is the Ruth Bancroft Garden of Walnut Creek. Now, Ruth Bancroft was a very interesting figure in that she was a cactus grower in pots, right? Just like many people start out. And then her husband said, I have about 1.5 hectares. The walnut trees are dying. Do you want that space next to the house to plant your succulents? And she went, yes. But of course, being Ruth Bancroft, she didn't merely go out and plant her succulents because the soil is actually quite bad here. The water not so great, and it gets rather cold in the winter for many succulents, and rather hot in the summer, although most of them like that. And so she had raised beds made. She hired a garden designer, and she had raised beds of crushed gravel made almost purely, and then planted her succulents along with companion plantings, all of them dry growing. She didn't grow anything that needed an excessive amount of water. You can see that large Yucca foliifera there, and remember that as the plant we saw, 140 some years old in the Stanford garden. This one, of course, as I say, is 1972. That's when she first planted the garden. And here's the side of the garden that has very few cacti. Here's one right here. But you can see she used a variety of things. These are like dry-growing shrubs and things like this. And she liked diversity. She liked not a whole lot of any one thing unless she made a little, like a bed of some particular plant. And yet she always paid a lot of attention to the texture and to the competing colors that were going on. She certainly had nice specimens, like this Pherocactus pottsii, and if you go there, it's open to the public. You can see many nice, beautiful specimens that will like make you salivate with wanting it. But to me, her main genius, at least, and she had others, she had many skills, but was this idea of using similar but different plants and combining them together to make these certain plantings. This was, when I was director, this was my favorite vignette in the garden, because it's almost all agaves. I think there's one or two yuccas, but plants of very similar form, very similar general form, but very different in the details. And everything's the devil's in the details, as they say. And we can see this just devastatingly effective particular planting. So not all one kind, and yet it has a very modern look to it, doesn't it? I think that's because of the combination of the general form of the plants used. And another planting of hers I adored is this bed that has white columnar cacti along with the cobweb house leek, Sempervivum arachnoideum, at the bottom. And even here, if you looked at the rest of the bed, you would see her approach to diversity, because the white columnar cacti, she had 3 or 4 species of white columnar cacti, and at least 4, if not 5, cultivars of the cobweb house leek in the same bed. So diversity, but also looking to make a very united and integrated impact. And she also, of course, experimented with what kind of plants, succulents, could be grown in this rather challenging place. This is Hespero yucca, or yucca whipplei. It's native to California, and so it is, once again, adapted to this summer rainfall, summer drought and winter rainfall regime that you find in Mediterranean-type climates, such as Morocco. The reason this is in a different genus is because unlike most yuccas, it's like an agave in that it dies after flowering. But it's a very, very beautiful plant. A bit spiky, I admit, but very beautiful. And the genus Dudleya, I wish to mention, that's something I have seen a few of in the Majorelle garden, but they tend to be coastal, but not always. Some grow in the desert. And they, once again, most of them are adapted to this winter rainfall regime, which not very many members of this family, the jade plant family, the Echeveria family, the sedum or stone crop family, Crassulaceae, not too many members of that family are adapted to that kind of regime, but this is. And I'll tell you something, this particular species is used extensively in the Ruth Bancroft garden, very much. And in the 2003 freeze, winter, very bad freeze, jade plants were damaged. Echeverias, most of them, badly damaged. Aeoniums killed. This thing, which lives on an island off of Southern California, did not care. It just came right through with perfection. And from this kind of dense planting, we can see what I would call, if I had to simplify things, oversimplify, I admit, one of the branches of modern cactus and succulent gardening in the landscape. And this is, I would call, the overplanting approach, where the succulents are used often in great repetition, often closely together, grouped together. And they're not quite carpet bedding. They're too three-dimensional, and they are too much of a three-dimension for it to qualify as regular carpet bedding. This is when done well, this is a very effective and beautiful approach. And you can see that once the plants grow in, there's very little weeding to do. But don't let that fool you. This does need a lot of maintenance to make sure that the plants look at their best, and they need to be pulled up, replanted, repropagated, et cetera, et cetera. Obviously, you can see the sedum here. The sedum angeline, it's called. This one, you'd have to make sure it doesn't grow out into the stairs, correct? It looks great, but you have to do that. So once again, a great sensitivity is needed, though, aesthetically and so. And the other thing we see in these modern succulent gardens, cactus and succulent gardens, is the use of interesting hardscaping, hard materials, such as slabs of concrete, sometimes vertical retaining walls of gray concrete, and also the use sometimes of rusted iron. Now, these are two materials that we do not associate with opulence. We associate them really with industrial uses. And adapting these to a garden, sets a certain tone. But the succulents, because of their incredible sculptural forms, do very well with this kind of background. However, just like the overplanting method, you have to use it. You have to have a good eye. You have to use it in a good way. Now, this to me, I see here, I see cobbles, I see rusted metal containers, I see slabs of concrete and agaves. I love every element of this, and yet it fails, in my opinion. To me, this is very ugly. And if I were to say why, I think it's because there's just too much of the neutral background, and the plants themselves are too separated. There's no integration whatsoever really going on here. And so it shows, and that's true whether you're talking about a garden, if you're talking about architecture, if you're talking about, I don't know, clothing or interior design. The simpler you get, and the more modern, the more simple the approach is, the more important it is, the tiny details, just the perfect details, because there aren't a lot of them. And so you really need to pay a lot of attention, and not everyone can do it. This is not to my taste, but I think this does succeed very well. Here are these succulents. They do not match in color or form, a little bit in form, but they're really kind of just sitting on their own. But because, sorry, keep doing that. Because they have this very neutral light gray or medium gray background, that serves as a nice background, just as you might go to an art show, an art exhibit, and see a white or very pale background with the individual pieces displayed in an art gallery. I think this works. So I would not have this in my yard, but I do think it actually works very well. This is another private residence, and this particular house was almost burnt down by a very large wildfire. It's in Southern California. And so when they went back to do their new landscaping, they wanted something fire resistant. There's nothing that's fireproof, right? And we can see here this foundation planting with the very muscular agaves, along with the very graceful use of fountain grass. And it works beautifully to kind of mask the bottom of this very severe house, very modernist, very, very simple, very severe. And so this kind of bottom helps break that up. And you see over here the ravine where the fire came up before, and it's planted with stuff that could burn again, but it's separated out by a lawn. Now, did I just say a dirty word? I mean, because I think it's not just in Morocco or in Marrakesh, but also in California, where the use of a lawn is seen as a very bad thing. And and I would, being a plant lover, I want to plant more plants. So I kind of agree with that general approach, as well as the water savings part of it. But in this particular case, the lawn separates out the house and the foundation plantings from this more jumbled, if you will, or more wild type planting on the right. And so it functions, I think, beautifully as, letting this frame around the house work on its own. So aesthetically, yes. And it also functions as a fire break. So the intense maintenance, and I'm sure you know if you've ever dealt with lawns, how much work and how much money they take to keep them nice looking like this, and how much water it takes in a time where our water is limited. I think in limited situations, or for example, in public spaces where we have children playing or people picnicking, there are situations where it is worth the time, effort, and money. And I think this was a sensitive use of the lawn. Now we're going to jump a little east of LA to the more drier parts and to this interesting place called Sunnylands Center. It's sort of a center for meetings for often international nonprofits meet there a lot. And the general structures were mostly built in the 1960s. So they're very much in high mid-century modern style. And you can see the cactus garden here is also in a very modernist style, but it was put in less than 20 years ago. And that points out something very interesting to me, because it seems to me that, with some few exceptions, I mean, Majorelle was one who took a very modernist approach back in the 1920s. Nevertheless, the modernist architecture came in and became very popular years, possibly decades, before the modernist approach to garden design really became very popular. So it took that many years for the landscaping around the center to match the general aesthetics of the buildings themselves. And here we see, once again, some of our favorites. We can see Lamericeros marginatus, the Mexican fence post cactus, the golden barrel cactus, Echinocactus grusonii. Over here, I think this is Parkinsonia or Circidium, along with Agave desmediana. And one of the last large gardens we're going to talk about is the one surrounding the Getty Center, Museum and Center in Los Angeles, Western Los Angeles. And hey, this is just like where we are here. We have a beautiful museum right next to a beautiful garden, but maybe it's a little bit bigger. And this very large garden in the center, it has very few succulents. There are succulents in this middle garden, which is the largest garden in the place. And we'll see some of them used as kind of bedding, in this very dense bedding in this central garden. We can see things like Mangave, which is a hybrid between agave and the closely related genus Manfreda. They're very popular in California now. I saw a couple in the Majorelle garden. They're not as spiny. They're not spiny at all, and they're kind of rubber. They have this rubbery, almost artificial texture. People go crazy over them. And you can see here it lived, and it also tolerates a little more water, so it's growing with non-succulents. However, there is a cactus garden at the Getty Center. It is the smallest of the gardens at the Getty Center. And yet, it is the garden that the vast majority of people who walk away from that place, they remember the most, because it is the most dramatic. And there's a couple reasons for that, in my opinion, maybe 10, maybe 20, but I'm going to talk about two. One is the borrowing of the skyline and the landscape. And here we have the skyline of Los Angeles being included as part of that garden. Now, this is a wonderful thing to do, and look at the mountains, how great that is. So my advice to you is, if you live in a flat area, immediately move to the mountains and build your garden so you can borrow a beautiful landscape like this. Maybe not Los Angeles, but whatever beautiful landscape. Maybe Marrakesh, maybe a beautiful panoramic view of Marrakesh. Also, you can see the extension of the travertine marble. If it isn't really marble, but we call it that, travertine marble walls of the buildings, so it integrates with the rest of the site. You can see a tree aloe here. And I don't know, Madison, if you're going to let yours in the garden get this big, but they do very well down there. But here is the actual garden itself. You can see, once again, our perennial favorite, golden barrel cactus, Echinocactus grusonii, and then other very limited palette. And now I'm going to talk about the other thing that I think makes this very successful. When a landscape designer, acting as God, starts to make a paradise or a landscape, he or she is looking down when they make the shapes and the sizes of the beds of the various parts of the garden. And they often have very nice geometric shapes and sizes in modern days, certainly. And sometimes that works out great. Other times, when they actually make the garden, when the people are down there walking around in the garden, they can't really appreciate that beautiful symmetry. In this case, there's only one place you can see the garden, from right here where I'm standing when I took this photograph, from above. So I'm having the landscape designer's view of this garden, and so is everyone else. In a way, if right behind you, when you stand here, they have a wonderful art collection. And this is like looking at a painting, right? You're standing in one place, you're looking at this thing somewhat from above. It's a somewhat two-dimensional landscape. And as I said, this is the garden that everyone most remembers from the Getty Center, Museum and Center. Now, probably you've been wondering once or twice, this is all well and good. Does it have anything to do with our favorite garden? Well, maybe your garden, your personal garden is your favorite, but our second favorite garden, the Majorelle garden. And the answer is yes and no, because Majorelle was acting in the 1920s. And then, of course, there were updates later, but still we can see a lot of the infrastructure, that hard surfaces he put in, and we can see very much this impact of the Moroccan style of gardening. This is a typical Moroccan fountain filtered through a surrealist or cubist type painter's eye. And also the color that is used, we'll talk about that a little bit more in a slide. Majorelle was using some of these techniques decades before almost any other landscape designers were using them, and yet, obviously and not surprisingly, he took a very different approach, a very personal approach, a very painter-like approach. And here we can see another of the fountains, and we can see an exaltation of Mexican fence post cacti growing here, and also the bright colors. And when we look at the garden, unlike most of these modernist gardens that I showed you before, where the background, the hardscape, is a neutral, a pale color that is just a background for the dramatic plants, here the dramatic plants work together with this very bright, this very forward, colorful landscape. And in my opinion, in my humble opinion, I think that this approach in very sunny climates, such as Marrakesh, is one that has never been fully integrated. Certainly, some people maybe have tried a little bit like it, but as far as being integrated into the general approach to landscape design in these warm and sunny climates, I don't think it has been done. And this way of setting off these incredible cacti that we love and that enrich our lives, really, this is a particularly unique approach that could be emulated elsewhere in some ways and inspired. Okay, thank you very much. Thank you very much.